Havana, Cuba, April 1961. The exploding cigar sat in its mahogany box inside a CIA safe house in Miami, ready for delivery. Technical Services Division Officer Sidney Gottlieb examined his handiwork with clinical satisfaction. The cigar was indistinguishable from the premium Cohiba Esplendidos that Fidel Castro famously enjoyed, except for one crucial modification. When lit, it would detonate with enough force to remove the Cuban leader's head. It was just one of dozens of schemes on the drawing board. In another office, chemists were preparing a diving suit contaminated with tuberculosis bacteria and fungal spores that would cause chronic disease. Down the hall, someone was drafting plans to place spectacular seashells packed with explosives in Castro's favorite diving spots. And in the most bizarre twist, agents had already delivered thallium salts to Cuba, a depilatory that would make Castro's iconic beard fall out, supposedly destroying his machismo and revolutionary mystique in a single humiliating molt. None of it would work. Not the cigars, not the poison pens, not the contaminated diving suit. Not any of the 637 documented assassination plots that would obsess the CIA for nearly 2 decades. Castro would outlast 8 American presidents, survive hurricanes of CIA creativity, and die of natural causes in 2016 at age 90, beard intact. But this spectacular failure reveals something far more important than simple incompetence. It exposes how the Cold War's most powerful intelligence agency became so fixated on eliminating one man that it descended into operatic absurdity, partnered with Mafia hitmen, violated its own laws, and ultimately damaged America's moral standing more than Castro ever could. When Fidel Castro marched into Havana on January 8, 1959, American policymakers initially saw him as a manageable problem, maybe even an asset. CIA intelligence assessments from early 1959 described Castro as a romantic, but not a communist. The State Department hoped this charismatic 32-year-old lawyer might prove more amenable to American interests than the corrupt Batista regime he'd overthrown. Those illusions shattered within months. By summer 1959, Castro had executed hundreds of Batista supporters, nationalized American-owned utilities and sugar plantations worth over $1 billion, and begun cozying up to the Soviet Union. CIA Director Allen Dulles told President Eisenhower in November 1959 that Castro represented a severe threat to American interests throughout Latin America. The bearded revolutionary wasn't just nationalizing property. He was exporting revolution, training guerrillas from across the hemisphere in Cuban camps, broadcasting Radio Havana's revolutionary propaganda from Argentina to Mexico. To Eisenhower's national security team, the solution seemed straightforward. Remove Castro, install a friendly replacement, restore the natural order. The president himself minced no words. "We cannot let the Castro government go on," Eisenhower declared in March 1960. When asked what could be done, CIA Deputy Director for Plans Richard Bissell, architect of the U-2 spy plane program, replied with characteristic confidence, "Assassination is one of the options." The White House approved plans for Castro's elimination with remarkable casualness. This was the height of American Cold War power, after all. The CIA had already orchestrated successful coups in Iran, 1953, and Guatemala, 1954. Castro seemed like a regional irritant compared to the Soviet nuclear threat. Senior officials believed removing one troublesome dictator 90 miles from Florida would be simpler than containing communism in Asia or Europe. The CIA's Technical Services Division, the same unit that had developed invisible inks, hidden cameras, and truth serums, approached the Castro problem like engineers solving an equation. "We had a man elimination unit," explained CIA officer Samuel Halpern years later. "Our job was to come up with ideas, and it was up to others to decide what to implement. The agency's medical services division joined in, offering pharmacological expertise. Someone suggested poisoning Castro's cigars. Someone else proposed contaminated scuba gear. The ideas multiplied like bureaucratic rabbits. From Moscow's perspective, American obsession with Castro looked like imperial overreach. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw opportunity in American hostility. Cuba offered the USSR something it desperately needed: a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a chance to plant missiles closer to American soil, a psychological victory against Yankee imperialism. KGB Chairman Alexander Shelepin authorized immediate protective measures for Castro, including Soviet bodyguards and counterintelligence training. The Cubans themselves understood the danger, but initially underestimated the scope. "We knew the Americans wanted me dead," Castro later recalled. "But we thought they would use traditional methods, a sniper, perhaps, or a commando raid." He couldn't imagine what was actually coming: a 20-year campaign of poisoned milkshakes, fungal powders, and partnerships with gangsters that would make the Kennedy assassination conspiracy theories look tame by comparison. The CIA's assassination program against Castro evolved from three distinct but intertwining origins: institutional momentum from previous covert operations, personal obsession from Kennedy-era officials, and genuine strategic concern about Soviet expansion in Latin America. The institutional foundation came from the agency's Technical Services Division, created in the early 1950s under Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist with a club foot and a passion for mind control experiments. Gottlieb's division had already administered LSD to unwitting subjects, including at least one who jumped from a window to his death, tested biological weapons, and developed an arsenal of exotic poisons. The Castro Project gave Gottlieb's team license to exercise their darkest creativity. The personal dimension crystallized under President John F. Kennedy. Despite his sophisticated Harvard pedigree, Kennedy arrived at the White House in January 1961, seething about Cuba. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion 3 months later, when 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles were crushed on the beaches, became Kennedy's greatest humiliation. "How could I have been so stupid?" Kennedy asked advisor Theodore Sorensen. The president's answer: redouble efforts to eliminate Castro. Attorney General Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and closest advisor, became the anti-Castro campaign's driving force. At meetings of the National Security Council's Special Group, Augmented, Bobby Kennedy pounded tables and demanded results. "My idea is to stir things up on the island with espionage, sabotage, general disorder," he told CIA officers in November 1961. Richard Helms, who would later become CIA director, testified that Bobby Kennedy's pressure was intense and absolutely clear. The strategic justification seemed compelling. By 1960, Castro had formalized Cuban-Soviet ties, accepting military aid, advisors, and economic subsidies worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Soviet weapons were flowing to Cuba: MiG fighters, patrol boats, tanks, artillery. Intelligence reports suggested Cuba was training 1,500 Latin American guerrillas at camps near Havana. Venezuela, Bolivia, and Nicaragua all faced Cuban-supported insurgencies. The domino theory that obsessed American planners about Southeast Asia applied equally to Latin America, or so policymakers believed. Operation Mongoose, the umbrella program for anti-Castro activities, officially launched in November 1961 with a $50 million budget and 400 CIA personnel. Air Force Brigadier General Edward Lansdale led the operation, reporting directly to Bobby Kennedy. Lansdale's 32-task project memorandum envisioned everything from economic warfare to psychological operations to, buried in careful euphemism, liquidation of Cuban leadership. But the CIA hedged its bureaucratic bets. Elimination operations ran through a separate channel called executive action. given the cryptonym ZR on her rifle. William Harvey, a hard-drinking, gun-toting CIA officer who kept weapons in his desk drawer, commanded ZR rifle. Harvey understood that assassination planning required plausible deniability. "If you're going to get into this," Harvey warned his colleagues, "you have to be prepared to go all the way." Going all the way meant recruiting outside help, specifically the Mafia. This decision remains one of Cold War history's most grotesque ironies. The U.S. government enlisting organized crime figures to eliminate a foreign leader in the name of democracy and freedom. The logic was darkly practical. Mobsters had lost millions when Castro nationalized Havana's casinos. They wanted revenge. They had connections in Cuba. And if caught, they provided perfect deniability. Robert Maheu, a former FBI agent turned CIA contractor, made the initial approach in September 1960. His contact, Johnny Roselli, a dapper Los Angeles mobster with ties to Sam Giancana, Chicago's top gangster, and Santos Trafficante, who had run Havana's casinos before Castro. The CIA offered $150,000 for Castro's elimination. Roselli agreed to help, for free, claiming patriotic motives, though he undoubtedly hoped for future favors regarding federal prosecutions. The Mafia connection produced the program's first serious assassination attempts. Trafficante, who maintained Cuban contacts, arranged for poison pills to reach Havana. CIA chemists prepared botulinum toxin capsules that would dissolve in liquid and kill within hours. In April 1961, the pills reached Cuba through an intermediary who knew someone with restaurant access to Castro. Castro never ate the poisoned food. The intermediary lost his nerve, or the opportunity never materialized, or the pills failed. Accounts vary. Meanwhile, Gottlieb's Technical Services Division was generating ideas with manic energy. They proposed contaminating Castro's cigars with botulinum toxin, cigars prepared, never delivered; dusting his shoes with thallium salts during a foreign trip to make his beard fall out, planned for a 1960 UN visit, abandoned; preparing a diving suit contaminated with fungus and tubercle bacilli. Castro was an avid diver. Placing explosive devices in seashells where Castro dove, seashells obtained, plan dropped as impractical. Impregnating the diving suit's breathing apparatus with tuberculosis bacteria, suit purchased, never delivered. Poisoned pens that could inject Castro during handshakes. Poisoned cigars that would explode when lit. A super sabotage effort to poison Castro's food or air supply. Some of these plans were seriously pursued. CIA Inspector General Lyman Kirkpatrick later wrote in a classified report, "Others were only ideas, maybe even jokes that somehow got into memoranda." The line between operational planning and bureaucratic fantasy had blurred. 3 specific operations between 1961 and 1963 reveal how the assassination program reached peak operational intensity and why it failed so catastrophically. The poison pills. April-June 1961. Juan Orta had everything the CIA needed. He worked in Castro's office, had access to the leader's food and drink, and claimed to be disillusioned with the revolution. Through the Mafia connection, CIA poison capsules reached Orta in April 1961. The pills contained botulinum toxin in a concentration sufficient to kill within hours. Orta needed only to slip one into Castro's food or beverage. For weeks, CIA officers waited for news from Havana. Nothing happened. Orta sent word that Castro had become unpredictable about meals, sometimes eating in his office, sometimes at home, sometimes not at all during marathon working sessions. The windows of opportunity kept closing. By June, Orta's nerve had broken. He sought asylum in a foreign embassy, eventually escaping Cuba. The poison pills remained unused. Castro later claimed he'd known about Orta all along. "We had penetrated the CIA operation. Castro told filmmaker Oliver Stone in 2003. "We knew what pills looked like, knew who had them. We let it play out to see how far they would go." Whether this was true or post facto bravado remains unclear. What's certain is that Cuban intelligence, trained by the KGB, had become formidable. The exploding seashell. Summer 1962. CIA Technical Services Division Officer James Donovan actually purchased a spectacular seashell, large enough to attract attention from an underwater diver. The plan was simple in concept, absurd in execution. Place the explosive-packed shell in an area where Castro regularly dove. Paint it bright colors to ensure he'd notice. Then detonate it remotely when he approached. The technical problems proved insurmountable. How would agents know when Castro approached? How would they guarantee he'd notice this particular shell among thousands of others? What if another diver found it first? The plan died in feasibility studies, though the shell reportedly sat in a CIA safe house for months, a monument to lethal whimsy. The poison pen. November 1963. This operation came closest to actual execution. CIA officer Desmond Fitzgerald, who had replaced William Harvey as Cuba operations chief, developed a relationship with Rolando Cubella Sacades, a Cuban official codenamed Amlash. Cubella had genuine revolutionary credentials. He'd fought with Castro in the Sierra Maestra, but had grown disillusioned with Cuba's Soviet orientation. On November 20, 1963, a CIA case officer met Cubella in Paris and handed him a specially designed ballpoint pen. The pen contained a hypodermic needle so fine that its injection would be almost imperceptible. Blackleaf 40, a commercial insecticide containing deadly nicotine sulfate, would kill within hours of injection. "There will be no antidote," the case officer explained. "It's absolutely reliable." Cubella accepted the pen. He returned to Cuba with vague plans to approach Castro at some future event. The date was significant for another reason. That same day, November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Kennedy's death immediately changed the Castro assassination calculus. Some conspiracy theorists would later claim Castro had Kennedy killed in retaliation for CIA plots, a theory lacking credible evidence but emotionally satisfying in its symmetry. More importantly, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, had little personal investment in eliminating Castro. LBJ cared about Vietnam, not Cuba. The obsessive Kennedy-era pressure lifted, but the plots continued, driven by bureaucratic momentum and true believers who thought Castro's removal remained essential. Cubella kept the pen for months. He never found his moment. In 1966, Cuban intelligence arrested him. Castro personally interrogated Cubella, who confessed everything. Castro spared his life. A propaganda victory was worth more than an execution. Cubella received 25 years imprisonment, serving just 9 before release. The turning point wasn't a single dramatic moment, but a gradual realization that permeated the CIA by 1964-65. The assassination program wasn't working and probably never would. Castro had survived everything from botulinum toxin to exploding cigars to Mafia hitmen. His security apparatus, trained by the KGB, had penetrated CIA operations repeatedly. More fundamentally, killing Castro wouldn't solve the Cuba problem. The revolution had institutional momentum beyond any individual. Soviet missiles would remain, Cuban-trained guerrillas would continue fighting across Latin America, and a martyred Castro might prove more dangerous than a living one. CIA officer Sam Halpern later described the dawning awareness. "We tried repeatedly to kill this guy, and we couldn't do it. He was either incredibly lucky or incredibly well protected, or we were incredibly incompetent. Probably all three. The assassination program's failure forced both superpowers to adapt their Cuba strategies, though neither would publicly acknowledge the elephant-sized corpse in the room. Hundreds of documented attempts to murder a foreign leader had accomplished nothing except demonstrating American desperation. American evolution, from murder to containment. By 1965, the CIA had largely abandoned direct assassination attempts. The Johnson administration, consumed by Vietnam and facing domestic upheaval, had no appetite for Caribbean adventures. But the bureaucratic infrastructure remained. Operations shifted from elimination to harassment, sabotage, and long-term containment. The CIA's Special Affairs Staff, which replaced Operation Mongoose, continued supporting anti-Castro activities with a revised mission: make Cuba costly for the Soviets, disrupt the Cuban economy, and prevent revolutionary export. Sabotage operations continued through the 1960s and 1970s. CIA-supported exile groups attacked Cuban infrastructure, though with carefully maintained deniability. One operation reveals the shift in approach. In 1971, CIA-backed exiles introduced African swine fever virus to Cuba, forcing the slaughter of 500,000 pigs and devastating pork supplies. The CIA has never officially confirmed involvement, but Newsday reported CIA connections in 1977, citing intelligence sources. The operation wasn't designed to kill Castro. It was economic warfare, targeting Cuba's protein supplies and agricultural capacity. Intelligence collection became the priority. By the late 1960s, the CIA had established sophisticated signals intelligence operations monitoring Cuban communications. The National Security Agency's Guantanamo Bay station intercepted Cuban military and government radio traffic. Spy satellites photographed Cuban installations. The focus had shifted from eliminating the man to containing the system. Politically, American policy calcified into permanent hostility. The 1962 trade embargo, initially imposed as temporary punishment, became permanent policy. Every administration from Kennedy through Obama maintained some version of isolation, though with varying intensity. Castro's survival became an embarrassing fact, requiring rationalization. American officials insisted the embargo was about principle, democracy, and human rights, carefully avoiding discussion of why assassination attempts had failed. Soviet counter-moves. Protecting the investment. The KGB took Castro's protection seriously, especially after the near miss with Kubela in 1963. Soviet intelligence officers trained Castro's personal security detail, implemented compartmentalized protection procedures, and helped establish Cuba's Directorate of Intelligence, DGI, which became one of the world's most effective intelligence services. By the late 1960s, Castro's protection detail numbered over 500 personnel. He varied his schedule erratically, never announced movements in advance, and used multiple decoy vehicles. His food was prepared by trusted personnel with security clearances. Foreign gifts were examined meticulously. The KGB helped Cuba establish a counterintelligence capability that successfully identified and rolled up CIA networks. Moscow's investment in Cuba expanded dramatically. By 1965, Soviet subsidies to Cuba exceeded $500 million annually, about $4.8 billion in 2024 dollars, covering oil shipments, military equipment, and general economic support. The Kremlin viewed this expense as strategically worthwhile. Cuba provided intelligence listening posts 90 miles from Florida, naval facilities for Soviet submarines, and ideological validation that socialism could succeed in the Western Hemisphere. Soviet military advisors helped Cuba build Latin America's most formidable military. By 1970, Cuba had 100,000 troops, modern Soviet tanks, MiG-21 fighters, and surface-to-air missiles. Castro had transformed from vulnerable revolutionary to entrenched Soviet client, protected by both his own competence and Moscow's commitment. Cuban countermeasures. Offense as defense, Castro's most effective survival strategy was offense. Rather than simply defending against CIA attacks, Cuban intelligence went after the attackers. The DGI successfully penetrated numerous exile organizations, feeding disinformation to the CIA and identifying agents before operations began. Cuba also retaliated asymmetrically. Rather than attempting to assassinate American presidents, which would invite overwhelming response, Castro focused on embarrassing revelations. Cuban intelligence passed information about CIA assassination plots to friendly journalists and international forums. By the 1970s, details of poison pills and exploding cigars were leaking into public consciousness, damaging CIA credibility. The ultimate Cuban countermove was simply surviving. Every year, Castro remained alive, diminished American prestige, and validated his own narrative. The bearded revolutionary who defied the empire. Castro understood the propaganda value. The CIA tried everything, he told interviewers repeatedly, describing plots in detail, sometimes with embellishment. Exploding cigars, poisoned scuba suits, they were obsessed. By turning assassination attempts into evidence of American moral bankruptcy, Castro transformed his survival into political victory. Third-party consequences. The blowback. The assassination program generated consequences far beyond Cuba. When details emerged during 1970s congressional investigations, particularly the Church Committee hearings of 1975-76, international reaction was devastating. American claims of moral superiority in the Cold War rang hollow when senators were questioning CIA officers about poison pens and Mafia partnerships. Latin American nations viewed the plots as confirmation of Yankee imperialism. If the CIA would attempt 600 police assassinations against Cuba's leader, what limits existed on covert action anywhere? The revelations validated leftist propaganda about American aggression and made anti-American positions politically safer throughout the hemisphere. The investigations also forced painful self-examination within American intelligence. CIA Director William Colby testified before Congress about assassination programs, revealing details that shocked even hardened Cold Warriors. The Church Committee's final report concluded that assassination violated American values and proved counterproductive. In 1976, President Gerald Ford issued Executive Order 11905, explicitly prohibiting political assassination. No employee of the United States government shall engage in or conspire to engage in political assassination. The order implicitly acknowledged what had become obvious. The Castro assassination program had failed completely while corrupting American institutions and damaging national credibility. The CIA had partnered with organized crime, violated its own charter, and accomplished nothing except proving that even the world's most powerful intelligence agency couldn't kill one determined man 90 miles offshore. The true peak of the assassination program wasn't any single operation, but rather a Senate hearing room in Washington on September 20, 1975. Senator Frank Church, Democrat from Idaho, held up a CIA poison dart gun before television cameras and asked CIA Director William Colby, "Does this pistol fire the dart?" Colby confirmed it did. Church continued, "And would that dart with the shellfish toxin cause death?" Colby answered quietly, "Yes, it would." That moment crystallized what the assassination program had become, a public spectacle of American moral failure. The gun hadn't been used on Castro. It had been developed for general assassination purposes. But it symbolized the entire grotesque enterprise. Americans watching the evening news saw their intelligence agency displaying weapons designed for murder, explaining techniques for untraceable killing, admitting partnerships with Mafia bosses. The Church Committee's investigation revealed 638 documented ways the CIA had attempted to kill or undermine Castro. though the actual number of plots may have been higher, as some records were destroyed. The list read like dark comedy. At least 8 separate poison pill attempts through various couriers, multiple contaminated cigar operations, the exploding cigar plan, prepared but never deployed, the depilatory powder scheme to make Castro's beard fall out, the contaminated diving suit, the explosive seashell, the poison pen given to Cuba, bacterial powder to be placed in Castro's scuba diving regulator, plans to poison Castro's food during foreign trips, sniper rifles provided to anti-Castro groups, high-powered rifles with telescopic sights provided to exiles, support for multiple exile commando raids aimed at Castro's assassination, collaboration with organized crime figures on at least 3 major operations. The human cost extended beyond Castro. CIA operations in Cuba resulted in deaths of dozens of exiles, accidental casualties from sabotage operations, and executions of suspected collaborators by Cuban security forces. The 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, planned partly to enable Castro's assassination in the chaos, killed 114 Cuban exiles and resulted in the capture of 1,189 more. 4 American pilots died in support operations. Cuban casualties from the invasion and subsequent reprisals exceeded 2,000 dead. The financial cost was staggering. Operation Mongoose alone consumed $50 million per year from 1961-1963, roughly $500 million in 2024 dollars. Total spending on anti-Castro operations between 1959 and 1975 likely exceeded $1 billion. None of it accomplished the primary objective. The strategic impact proved equally disastrous. Rather than eliminating Cuba as a Soviet client, the assassination program strengthened Castro's position. Soviet protection intensified. Cuban security capabilities improved dramatically. Castro's domestic legitimacy increased. He could credibly claim to face an existential threat from American aggression, justifying authoritarian measures. The embargo and assassination attempts enabled Castro to blame Cuba's economic problems on external enemies rather than internal failures. Most damagingly, the program corroded American institutions. The CIA had violated its 1947 charter, which prohibited domestic operations, by working with the Mafia on U.S. soil. The agency had lied to presidents, concealed operations from Congress, and destroyed evidence. When Church Committee investigators asked why assassination plots continued after Kennedy's death, they discovered the answer. Bureaucratic momentum and personal obsession had replaced any coherent policy framework. International damage was severe and lasting. Third world nations pointed to the plots as evidence of American hypocrisy about international law and national sovereignty. European allies questioned American judgment. Soviet propagandists had decades of material. The Americans talk about democracy while they send poison pills to murder foreign leaders. Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko declared in a 1976 UN speech, for once telling the uncomfortable truth. The Cuban people themselves paid the highest price. The failed assassination plots and ongoing American hostility provided Castro with justification for domestic repression that continued decades after any genuine threat had passed. Thousands of Cubans were imprisoned for suspected collaboration with American intelligence. Freedom of expression remained restricted, partly because the regime could cite ongoing U.S. hostility. The embargo created genuine hardship for ordinary Cubans, while doing nothing to weaken Castro's grip. By the time Fidel Castro stepped down from power in 2006, due to illness, not assassination, he had ruled Cuba for 47 years, longer than any Cold War leader except Kim Il-sung in North Korea. He died peacefully on November 25, 2016, at age 90, surrounded by family. His beard remained intact to the end. The CIA's failed campaign to assassinate Fidel Castro stands as a monument to how fear, obsession, and institutional momentum can lead a democratic nation's intelligence services into moral and strategic disaster. The 638 documented plots accomplished nothing except demonstrating the limits of American power, the folly of personalized foreign policy, and the ease with which covert operations can escape democratic accountability. The program's most important legacy emerged from its exposure. The Church Committee investigations of 1975 to 76 revealed not just the Castro plots, but a broader pattern of CIA overreach. Coup plotting, domestic surveillance, mind control experiments, and assassination programs targeting multiple foreign leaders. These revelations triggered fundamental intelligence reforms, including the creation of permanent congressional oversight committees, restrictions on covert operations, and the explicit prohibition of assassination that remains U.S. policy today. The Castro assassination program also demonstrated a hard truth about Cold War dynamics. Killing individual leaders rarely changes systemic conflicts. Had any plot succeeded, Cuba would have remained communist, Soviet-aligned, and hostile to American interests. Castro's brother Raúl, or another loyalist, would have continued the revolution. Soviet missiles would have stayed until the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis forced their removal through diplomacy, not assassination. The Cuban intelligence service would have maintained its effectiveness. Only the American moral position would have changed, and not for the better. The program reveals the particular pathology of the Kennedy administration's approach to Cuba. John and Robert Kennedy transformed geopolitical competition into personal vendetta. The emotional investment in eliminating Castro, driven by Bay of Pigs humiliation and the missile crisis's terror, warped strategic judgment. Subsequent presidents continued the policies partly from institutional inertia, partly from political fear of appearing soft on Castro. Contemporary parallels deserve examination. The post-9/11 targeted killing program using drones operates under legal frameworks designed partly in response to the Castro-era abuses. The explicit prohibition on assassinating foreign leaders remains policy, though the line between targeted killing of terrorists and political assassination remains perpetually contested. The Castro legacy reminds us that assassination programs, once begun, resist termination through bureaucratic and political momentum. For Cuba, the assassination plots and ongoing American hostility enabled Castro's authoritarianism while preventing any constructive engagement that might have encouraged liberalization. The embargo and isolation, maintained partly because no American politician wanted to appear to reward the man who survived 600 assassination attempts, hurt ordinary Cubans while strengthening the regime. Only in 2014 did President Obama begin normalizing relations, acknowledging that 50 years of hostility had failed to achieve American objectives. The story circles back to that Miami safe house in 1961, where Sidney Gottlieb examined his exploding cigar with professional satisfaction. He genuinely believed he was defending freedom by preparing to blow up a dictator's head. The same conviction motivated hundreds of CIA officers, Mafia hitmen, Cuban exiles, and government officials who planned, funded, and attempted Castro's assassination. They believed the end justified any means, that American interests required Castro's death, that one man's elimination would solve a systemic problem. They were wrong about all of it. The exploding cigar never reached Castro's lips. The poison pills dissolved unused, the beard never fell out. And the United States learned, slowly, painfully, at tremendous cost, that intelligence services in a democracy cannot operate outside democratic constraints, that assassination as policy breeds only corruption and failure, and that sometimes the most powerful nation on earth cannot kill one determined man 90 miles from its shores, no matter how much poison it prepares or how many seashells it paints. Fidel Castro won this particular Cold War battle not through superior force or cunning, but through the simple, maddening act of survival. His greatest weapon against American power was staying alive.